Vincent Van Gogh is perhaps the modern symbol of the tortured genius. He was brilliant, but was also plagued by severe mental illness. He isolated himself, had violent fits of rage, and famously cut off his own ear. And yet, we romanticize it. When we look closely, the portrait of Van Gogh becomes far more complex, and perhaps even more inspiring. Van Gogh's early life was fairly uneventful. While he drew pictures from time to time, there was never any real indication of artistic talent. Art only became a constant in his life around the age of 16, when he began working at his uncle's art dealership. During this time, he became infatuated with his landlady's daughter. She rejected his advances, which led him to become increasingly isolated and religious. This is often seen as Van Gogh's first break from reality. He was eventually fired, after which he drifted into a role as a minister's assistant, spending the next 4 years trying to become a preacher. Instead of preparing for his theology studies, Vincent wandered the countryside, preaching to coal miners in Belgium. He gave away his possessions and slept on the floor, earning him the nickname the Christ of the Coal Mine. This behavior came off as completely fanatical and obsessive to the church leaders, so they dismissed him as unfit for the ministry. He then fell into a deep depression, and in a letter to his brother Theo wrote, "My only anxiety is, how can I be of use in the world?" In the fall of 1880, Van Gogh decided to move to Brussels to become an artist. Despite having little formal art training, his brother Theo offered to support him financially. Vincent was an extremist in his lifestyle. He lived in cramped rooms, barely surviving on Theo's money, typically choosing to spend what little he had on paint rather than food. He rejected bourgeois values entirely. Money meant nothing to him except as something he needed in order to keep working on his art. In 1883, he moved to Nune, a small village in the Netherlands where within 2 years he completed nearly 200 oil paintings. Among them was The Potato Eaters, which is now seen as his first masterpiece and a clear representation of Vincent being what he called a painter of peasant life. Van Gogh was drawn to the working class, seeing them as an embodiment of Christly ideals. Theo, an art dealer in Paris, tried to sell it alongside his other works, but he ultimately failed, claiming that Vincent's dark palette was just too out of place next to the bright and colorful style of Impressionism. In 1886, Vincent moved to Paris, showing up at Theo's apartment uninvited. Theo had little success in selling his work, but he did introduce Vincent to the Impressionist art scene. That, and his growing fascination with Japanese prints, led him to adopt a much brighter and bolder palette. It's at this point that Van Gogh, as we know him, really began to come into his own. He also met many of the leading artists at the time, including Edgar Degas, Camille Pissarro, and Paul Gauguin. Van Gogh and Gauguin became close friends. Van Gogh admired him deeply, seeing him as a disciple of the new art. After a couple years, Van Gogh found himself burned out by the stress and pressure of the Paris art scene, and was thrilled by the idea of a simpler life. So Vincent left for Arles, a quiet city in the south of France, where he spent full days outdoors painting the vibrant scenery. There, he dreamed of starting an art colony, though the only artist enticed by Vincent's proposal was Gauguin. The two got along well for some weeks, but eventually, Gauguin found living with Van Gogh increasingly unbearable, which isn't surprising as Van Gogh wasn't great with people and was notoriously intense and difficult. By this point, he had begun to suffer from sudden terrors and lapses of consciousness, in addition to violent outbursts. For his part, Van Gogh wavered between fondness and loathing toward Gauguin. The two painters drifted apart in their styles, eventually no longer sharing a common view of art. Van Gogh idolized Gauguin and wanted to be his equal, but Gauguin was arrogant and domineering, which frustrated Van Gogh. It seems likely that Vincent realized that Gauguin was planning to leave, and it was during this time he had his first episode. Seemingly hearing voices, he cut off a piece, or possibly even the entirety, of his left ear and gave it to a maid at the nearby brothel where he'd been a frequent customer. At least, that's how the popular story goes. A different version of events claims that it was Gauguin himself who cut off Vincent's ear. Either way, this marked the beginning of Van Gogh's increasing break from reality. Following the attack, he was admitted to a hospital in Arles. Doctors diagnosed him with acute mania with generalized delirium. One of the doctors even suggested what he called mental epilepsy. Over time, nearly 30 different diagnoses have been suggested, but many researchers believe bipolar disorder is one of the strongest explanations. Vincent's own lifestyle complicates any single diagnosis. He smoked constantly, drank large amounts of coffee, and often ate poorly, sometimes even fasting entirely. The natural consequence of all this was malnutrition to the point that he eventually lost many of his teeth. He also drank heavily, especially absinthe, a strong alcoholic drink with convulsant properties that was popular among French artists. There's even some evidence that Van Gogh ingested his paint, which can cause things like mood swings and hallucinations. After he was discharged, he continued to experience these hallucinations and delusions of poisoning. A few months later, he checked himself into a mental asylum in the small town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, where he wrote, "I put my heart and my soul into my work, and have lost my mind in the process." It was during this period that Van Gogh created some of his most iconic works, including The Starry Night. But he also suffered repeated breakdowns. At one point, one of his doctors noted that he even may have tried to poison himself by ingesting paint and kerosene. Eventually, Vincent became convinced that the asylum was making him worse. So after a year-long stay, his doctor declared him cured, and he left Saint-Rémy. If there's one thing that we can say about Van Gogh, it's that he really didn't stay anywhere for very long. Only days later, he left for Auvers-sur-Oise, a town just outside Paris, which was close enough to Theo, but far enough that he could still seek the simple life he so desired. He carried on producing painting after painting, but the countryside didn't have the healing power he had hoped for, as his depression and overall condition continued to worsen. So on July 27, 1890, Van Gogh walked into the middle of a wheat field and shot himself in the stomach with a revolver. Later that evening, he apparently was revived by the cooler temperature and awoke in search of the revolver to finish the job. Unable to find the weapon, he returned to his room at the Gauguin. He reportedly told the police, "My body is mine and I am free to do what I want with it. Do not accuse anybody." A telegram was sent to Theo, who arrived by train and stayed with him as Vincent slowly died. He passed away 2 days later at 37 years old. That's the typical story, at least. Researchers Stephen Nafa and Gregory White-Smith argue it's unlikely that Van Gogh took his own life, as in his letters, he had described such action as sinful and immoral. There are also several oddities, like how he managed to walk the mile back home after such a severe wound. His painting supplies and the revolver used were never found, and the bullet itself entered Van Gogh's body at an angle, not straight on as you might expect. These researchers suggest that he was instead a victim of foul play, referencing a local teenage boy named René Secreton, who was known to carry a faulty revolver and for being a bit of a bully to Van Gogh. If he shot him, it's possible that Vincent, not yet realizing the extent of his wound, decided to make his way back to the inn, and René, terrified, may have tried to clean up the scene, taking the gun and Vincent's art supplies. The authors argue that Van Gogh may have welcomed death and believed the boys had done him a favor, hence him saying to not accuse anyone. This makes sense given his mental state, as he had once written, "I would not expressly seek death, but I would not try to evade it if it happened." All in all, Van Gogh's life was definitely turbulent, but the popular image of him as a completely unrecognized and unloved genius is partially a myth. Only one painting is known for certain to have been sold in his lifetime, but Van Gogh also often traded his work with other artists in exchange for food or painting supplies. In this sense, Vincent actually sold quite a bit of work during his lifetime. Within artistic circles, his paintings were exhibited in both Brussels and Paris during his time at Saint-Rémy. He was shown alongside artists like Camille Pissarro, Paul Cézanne, and Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and he even had admirers among major figures like Claude Monet. Vincent pursued art only in the last decade of his life, half of which was spent learning and perfecting his techniques. So of course he didn't have a lot of time to get out there and market himself. Van Gogh's paintings also pushed into the avant-garde, which for many people at the time was simply too strange. Van Gogh certainly wasn't alone in this, as even Monet didn't begin selling his work until his mid-40s. His early Impressionist paintings, which are now considered masterpieces, were initially rejected as ugly and technically crude. So while Van Gogh didn't sell much during his lifetime, it certainly isn't as tragic a situation as popular culture suggests. It was actually pretty common. It's almost impossible to separate Vincent van Gogh from the idea of Vincent van Gogh. He did have periods of mental instability, but for much of his life, he was remarkably lucid. You can see it clearly in his letters, which are actually rather eloquent and intelligent. What we also forget is that Van Gogh created his most iconic works during periods of recovery and through intense discipline. Yet the popular narrative is that they were a side effect of his uncontrollable passions. What we're left with is this romanticized view that makes us feel as if we're giving Van Gogh the appreciation he deserved in his lifetime, but instead, we're continuing to ignore him in a different way, ignoring the nuances of the human, and instead glorifying the myth of the tragic genius.